According to the theory of evolution, the origin and development of the universe and all its systems can be explained solely on the basis of time, chance, and continuing processes. All living things have arisen from a single-celled organism. A second and opposing worldview is the concept of creation. According to the theory of creation, everything in the universe has come into being through the design, purpose, and deliberate acts of a supernatural creator. That means this creator created the universe, the earth, and all life on earth, including all types of plants and animals, as well as humans. On today's edition of Origins, we'll talk about the age of the earth from a biblical standpoint.
Hi friends, welcome to Origins. My name's Don Chapman and I'm the host of Origins. It's great to have you with us today, and it's also great to have with us Dr. Brad Harrub. And Brad is a PhD from the University of Tennessee in biology, neurobiology and anatomy.
That's
Thank
correct.
you, I'll get
That's
it
right.
right. I just want to tell the folks that, that Origins is a forum to use scientific evidence to validate the truth of creation.
That's right.
And we're thrilled to have you here today to talk with us.
We're going to start with this idea of, could the patriarchs have lived to such vast old ages? You know, it doesn't take long in reading through the Bible. Adam, we know, he lived to be 930 years old, and you're reading along through there, and surely our children, our grandchildren, at some point they're going to come to us and say, are these real ages? Are these literal ages? Or are we maybe supposed to divide them by 10 or something? So the first question then, how did those ancient patriarchs live to such vast old ages? What we need to get across to our children, to our grandchildren, is that the world in which these patriarchs lived was vastly different than the world you and I are living in today. Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace described it as a mantle of spring-like loveliness. So the question becomes, why is it we die today? You know, well, let's say I've got Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease or congestive heart failure. True, but all of those are tied to the same thing, and that is we now have over 1,300 harmful genetic mutations in our gene pool. That number should probably be updated to about 1,500, none of which is any good for us. And I seriously doubt that there are too many families out there that aren't affected by at least one or two of these genetic mutations. Now the question then becomes, okay, how many of these genetic mutations were around when God first placed Adam and Eve on this earth? The answer, there were none.
There were no genetic mutations.
Exactly. There was no Alzheimer's. There was no Parkinson's.
So everything was good.
Exactly. In fact, in Genesis 1, verse 31, he looks at his creation and pronounces it not just good, but very good.
That's right.
So if we were to picture in our minds this mantle of spring-like loveliness, we know that God has pronounced everything very good. Then the question then becomes, why couldn't the patriarchs have lived to such vast old age? You know, think about it. There were no factories billowing out smoke. We hadn't yet dumped DDT on the ground or Agent Orange on our troops, or we hadn't painted our houses with lead paint. We hadn't filled our schools with asbestos. If you were to ask most people today, who is the oldest person on record, many of our young people would turn to this book, and they would tell us that Madame Janine Louise Calment of France lived to be 122 years, 164 days old, and then she died. But that's not what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us there in Genesis chapter 5, verse 27, that all the days of Methuselah were 969 years old, and he died. I want to give you, Don, just a real quick example of how we can know which one of these is right. In the story found in Genesis, remember Sarah and Abraham, they're going down into Egypt. There was a famine in the land. Abraham turns to Sarah and he says, "Behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon." He said, "Therefore it shall come to pass when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they'll kill me. But they will save thee alive. So say, I pray, that thou art my sister." Now, some commentators have made the point that Abraham and Sarah were really half-brother, half-sister, so maybe this was just a half-lie. But you remember the story.
It wasn't Abraham's best day, that's for sure.
Exactly. You remember that Sarah was, in fact, taken into the Pharaoh's house. The plagues rained down. But my point is this. Have we ever stopped to calculate Sarah's age?
Yeah.
When Abraham turns to her and says, "Behold, you are a beautiful woman." She was pushing nearly 70 years old. Now, olive oil is good, but it's not that good.
No.
So here we have biblical evidence. We also have scientific evidence that this earth, this world, was once a different place. For instance, if you were wanting to check this out, you could go down to your local library and check out the diaries of Admirals Byrd and Perry, those two men who traversed adversity to reach the poles. And you read there about them looking down into the ice and seeing things like palm trees and fruit trees.
When they got to both the North and the South Pole, and they looked through the ice, they saw tropical vegetation.
Exactly, buried there, feet below the ice. So we know this earth has changed.
It isn't as it always was.
Exactly. Another question that comes up is, where did Cain get his wife? I'm sure you've probably been asked this several times. You're reading along there in Genesis, the early books, and everything seems to be flowing chronologically. And then all of a sudden it talks about Cain walking out into the land of Nod and finding a wife. Where did Cain get his wife? Well, using what we've already talked about thus far, let's look at three different options. Could God have, if he'd wanted, taken and placed groups of people all over the planet? Cain wandered into one of those groups of people and met a wife, settled down, lived happily ever after. That's option number one. Or could Cain have married a niece? The Bible tells us that Adam and Eve had other children after Seth, so could he have waited till his brothers and sisters married, they had offspring, waited till that offspring then matured? That's option number two. Or could Cain have married a sister? Now, those are our three options. Let's look at each one of them. Did you notice how I worded the first one very carefully? I said, could God have if he'd wanted? Yeah, but here we've got a Bible, and it tells us pretty much precisely what God did do. If we were to open it to Genesis chapter 2, we read in verse 21, "And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. Then the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, he had made into a woman, and he brought her to man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." We skip over one chapter more, Genesis chapter 3, verse 20. And we read, "And Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was mother of all living."
Mother of all living.
That pretty much settles it.
It really does.
It says simply that all of the lineage of humanity would come through Eve. So the first option, we'll throw it out. What about the second option? Could Cain have married a niece? Now, try as hard as I can't prove or disprove that particular theory. But I think given the amount of time that he would have had to wait for his siblings to grow, mature, reproduce, I think the best option is actually option number 3.
I do too.
And if you were to say that in a high school setting today, marry your sister, most of the guys would say,
yeah,
marry us. I can't even imagine somebody else marrying my sister. And that one word comes to mind, the word incest.
That's right.
But we know that it hasn't always been that way. In fact, we know that one of God's first commands to Adam and Eve was to be fruitful and multiply. And it wasn't until Leviticus chapter 18 that he repealed that particular law in which he did not want relations between family members.
So what we're saying is that God made his law, as he has with all of his laws, for our good.
That's right.
And when the gene pool was pure, there wasn't a need for a law like that.
That's exactly right.
But when all of these mutations entered the gene pool to make it defiled, then God had to institute laws.
Exactly. And there was something that changed everything.
Yeah. And what was that?
And the events of Genesis chapter 6 through 9. And so I want us to talk for just a few minutes about the story of Noah and the flood and some of the events that transpired. You know, a lot of people, they argue that it's not scientifically accurate. You know, I used to get phone calls and emails from evolutionists and atheists who would, with very bitter words, tell me there's no way this thing happened. But then something even more disturbing happened. Some of those calls and some of those emails came in from Christians. And they used nicer words, but their words said the same thing, and that is, Brad, there's no way this thing is scientifically accurate.
So I'm asking you, Dr. Brad, is the story of Noah a myth, or is it factual, something that factually happened, and is it scientifically feasible that Noah's flood happened?
It definitely is scientifically accurate. I want us to look at some of these alleged contradictions, some of the problems associated with the Noahic flood. We're going to start with this idea that Noah wasn't smart enough. You know, according to evolutionists, early people were ignorant. They were dumb, club-carrying like creatures. But if we go all the way back before the days of Noah, and we look in Genesis chapter 2, we see Adam there. I'm going to read Genesis chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. Out of the ground, the Lord God formed every beast of the field, every bird of the air, and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever Adam called each of the living creatures, that was his name. So Adam gave name to the cattle, to the birds of the air, to the beasts of the field. And so here, before Eve is even on the scene, we have Adam communicating with God. In fact, he gives Adam the task. He says, I'm going to parade those animals in front of you. I want you to name those animals. You know, the indication being he's not just to name them, but he's also to remember that name to pass on to his offspring. We flip over to Genesis chapter 4, verses 21 and 22. We read of a man named Jubal, who was the father of all who play the harp and the flute, a fellow named Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. We're just a few short generations from Adam and Eve, and already we have people smelting the metals.
Right.
You know, the next time somebody says that early people weren't smart, ask them these questions. You know those Egyptian pyramids, or the 100-foot Colossus at Rhodes, or the Sphinx, or even Stonehenge? How did those things get there?
Build me a pyramid and come back and talk to me, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We don't have a clue how. And you know, in some instances, they drug stones weighing 60 tons over 200 miles, dropped them into place. We don't have any idea how they did it.
Yeah.
So don't let people tell you that early people were dumb.
In fact, before the fall, I would dare say Adam was a whole lot smarter than you and I.
That's correct.
No doubt about it.
Exactly. What about the size of the ark? You know, a lot of people say, the ark wasn't big enough. Well, we have the dimensions, don't we? Genesis chapter 6, verse 15 says, this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark should be 300 cubits, the width 50, the height 30. So we know it's 300 by 50 by 30. A cubit being roughly 18 inches, the length of a man's forearm. So this thing was 450 feet long, football field and a half long. We also know God instructed Noah to put 3 decks on it. So if we were to use a conservative estimate of say, 17 inches, or 17-inch cubit, and figure out how much volume, how much storage space Noah had on board that particular boat, we could calculate volume and figure up he had roughly 1.39 million square feet of storage space.
That's a lot of space.
That's a whole lot of space. But since many of our viewers may not be able to even comprehend a number that big, I want to break it down for you in a way in which I think you can remember. If we were to go out to the local railroad station and start counting boxcars as they passed by, 1, 2, 3, and we get all the way up to 52, all 52 of those railroad boxcars would fit on board that ark without any problem.
That's a lot of boxcars.
And 9 more trains.
9
just
times
like
52.
That. A total of 520 railroad boxcars.
Wow. That's a lot of space.
This wasn't some little Sunday afternoon sailing ship. This was the biggest ship ever built to date. You know, the question becomes, who created the animals? God did. Don't you think he could have gotten the calculations right of what he needed? How big a space he needed to put his animals on board? Another question that often comes up is, what about the water? Where did the water come from? Well, the Bible tells us very plainly. Genesis chapter 7 tells us in verse 11 that on that day the fountains of the great deep were broken up, the windows of heaven were open. And I want to share with you how we know precisely exactly how much water God knew he needed to place aboard on this earth. Hopefully you're familiar with the draft of a boat. You know, if you're going to build a cigarette speedboat, you want that thing to go fast, so you don't want it sitting very deeply in the water. Whereas if you have something like a Shell oil ocean tanker that has to go transatlantic, that boat's going to sit much deeper. The draft of it's going to be much deeper because it has to be able to withstand those pounding waves. Well, what would the draft of the ark have been? Well, we know it wasn't built for speed, was it? Didn't have any place to go. But it did need to be able to withstand those pounding waves. And if you were to ask any shipbuilder, they'll tell you it's roughly 1/2 the height. So we know the ark would have settled down into the water roughly 1/2 the height. Remember the dimensions again were 300 by 50 by 30. So it's going to settle in roughly 15 cubits. We then open our Bibles. We read Genesis chapter 7 verses 19 and 20 that state, "And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward above the high mountains, and they were covered." God knew exactly how much water he needed to place on those mountaintops to keep the bottom of that boat from bashing into them.
So you have just enough water to get the boat over the top of the mountains. Wow.
Genesis chapter 8 verse 1 says, God remembered Noah.
Amen. He sure did.
He did. He did. But what about those human races? How do we explain all the different colors of people if we all came from 8 or, realistically, even just 2 people?
2 people. Well, you know, we got to take a break right now, and I'm real curious to know what you think about the human races and how they fit together and what that has to do with all of this. So as soon as we come back, we're going to check out the human races, and Dr. Brad's going to fill us in. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Creation versus evolution, you weigh the evidence. Eve, the mother of all, her DNA is remarkable. Over recent years, scientists have conducted a lot of research on DNA that's found in the mitochondria of a cell. Now, this DNA is only inherited through females. By comparing mutation or mistakes in the DNA of people worldwide, scientists came to a startling conclusion. It looks as if all people living today are descended from one woman. With the latest mutation data, the ancestral mother of all lived a mere 6,000 years ago. Today's guest on Origins, Dr. Brad Harrub, is also the co-author of several books, including The Truth About Human Origins. If you have an interest in the creation-evolution controversy, you'll definitely want The Truth About Human Origins for your personal library. Book orders are being taken at 1-800-234-8558. Dr. Harrub also serves as the Director of Scientific Information at Apologetics Press and has written many articles concerning creation that are available. For more information about our guest, you can write to Apologetics Press Incorporated, 230 Landmark Drive, Montgomery, Alabama, 36117, or visit their website at www.apologeticspress.com.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to Origin. So we're so glad to have you with us, and we are thrilled today that we have Dr. Brad Harrub with us, and he is the Director of Scientific Information at Apologetics Press. And just before we went to our break, he brought up the whole subject of human races. Teach our folks a little genetics today,
okay,
and help us understand that the only race God's interested in is the human race.
That's right. Sadly, society has come along and they have tossed in this idea of different color skins. Charles Darwin, most people don't know that in his original book on the origin of species, the full title talks about favored races. And so it's obvious that from an evolutionary perspective, there is a gradual progression of colors progression of races.
And so in that, Hitler finds justification for saying the Aryan race is a superior race and ought to dominate the world. And the whole of Europe finds justification for saying we can go out and colonize the rest of the world and use it to bankroll our nations. So all of that evil and conquering and killing really has its roots in evolution, doesn't it?
That's right. We know today that skin color is caused by a biological pigment known as melanin. Everybody has melanocytes, and inside those melanocytes is different amounts of melanin.
So everybody has the same kind of skin.
Exactly.
It's just how much melanin is in the skin.
And the amounts that you got are a direct result of two people, your mom and your dad.
Okay.
So we all have melanocytes. Geneticists have come along and they have given designations as far as how much melanin there is. If you have, for instance, very dark skin, they're using capital letters, capital A, capital B, to indicate those dominant genes. If you're a very fair-skinned person, they use little letters, little a, little b, to designate for someone that doesn't have very much melanin at all.
So the Swedes are A and B.
Little a, little b.
Little a, little b.
That's right.
And the Africans are pretty much capital A, capital B.
That's correct.
All right.
So knowing that, the question then becomes, okay, is there a way that we can look at two people, Adam and Eve, where their offspring would actually be a result and would show us all this rainbow of colors? Can we take two people and explain all the different colors we see around us today? On the chart, you see 4 different possibilities, so we'll start with number 1.
Okay.
Were Adam and Eve very dark-skinned people? That is, capital A, capital A, capital B, capital B. If we were to do that particular cross, all of their offspring would be capital A, capital A, capital B, capital B, the very darkest of skins possible. And we look around us today, we know that's not the case.
The whole world would be dark-skinned.
Exactly.
Obviously it isn't. Okay.
So we toss out number 1. What about number 2? Same type of concept. If Adam and Eve were both fair-skinned, little a, little a, little b, little b, all of their offspring would be little a, little a, little b, little b.
So we probably didn't have a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Adam.
Exactly.
Okay.
Even though some of the Sunday school material may show them that way.
That's right.
Okay, what about, let's look for just a moment at exactly what is the colors we see out there today. For instance, we know today 55% of the world's population is Caucasian, 37% is Mongoloid or Asian, and then 8% is Negroid. So we know those first 2 options are not really a possibility.
Okay.
Moving on to the third one, though. What if Adam were dark-skinned and Eve were light-skinned? On the screen, you see what's called a Punnett square. It's what geneticists use to figure out the possibilities of offspring. And what I'm going to do is show you, if we were to say the top row up here was Adam's genes.
Okay.
Down this left-hand side, we'll say those are Eve's. Each one of these boxes, then, represents the possibility of a child, their possible offspring color. And in this particular case, we've got all those 16 boxes are right down the middle tan.
Okay. So everybody would come out middle tan.
Exactly, and that's not what we see either.
So again, we would have a uniformity across the earth.
Exactly. We do have one option left, though.
Okay.
What if Adam and Eve were heterozygous?
Heterozygous.
We have one who is very fair-skinned.
Okay.
We have 4 individuals who are light tan, 6 through the middle that are tan, 4 that are darker brown, 1 very dark-skinned person, for a total of 16, and 1 very tired mother.
Yes, she sure was. Heterozygous just means
They have
one
both,
capital letter and one small letter.
Exactly. They have both the dominant and the recessive genes.
All right. Now,
So from 2 individuals, we can get all of these skin colors. How many people walked off the ark?
8.
8. So if I can give you this with 2, just imagine how many possibilities we can get with all the people that walked off the ark.
That's very interesting, but it's also very interesting to go back and say that from one set of parents, Adam and Eve, you can get every combination that we have on the earth today.
That's right.
You know, these things are so important, and that's why I'm so grateful that you've taken the time to come and be with us on Origins. This is such solid and good information. And I want to appeal to folks, if you've got questions that we can answer, check out our email address there and send in those questions. We not only have Dr. Brad, we have a whole pool of godly creation scientists that will help us find solid answers to your questions and your children's questions. And then secondly, this genetic information that you've given us is so important. If we could stamp out the hatred in the world, if we could get people to see that we don't judge people by how much of a chemical is in their skin, but we judge people by the fact that God had one, we all go back to Adam and Eve, to one set of ancestors, and so we're all brothers and sisters. We're all in this together.
That's right.
And if we could stamp out that hatred and foster some love. You know, evolution has put us in a terrible fix of feeling superior over other people. That's a terrible thing that needs to be refuted and done away with. You know, my friends, that's just not the kind of God that created this world. He's a God of love. He's a God of acceptance. He's a God of forgiveness. I want to remind you that it's God's view that he made you, and that should be your worldview too. I hope you'll come back and be with us for Origins again real soon. God bless you.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the information presented today, you can download a PDF file of program number 442 from our website at www.origins.tv.org. For a printed version, send a $5 donation to cover shipping and handling to Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148. Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and the financial support of you, our Cornerstone Television family.